Hey, if you like this video, then please consider supporting my work on Patreon, where you can help me afford to pay rent and give my cat a break from powering my computer. Have you ever been watching a movie or playing a game and it brings up a loaded topic and you just know beyond a shadow of a doubt that it's not going to handle it very well? Well, that happened to me somewhat recently when I was watching the first Wicked movie and it got to the topic of the animal racism. Discrimination is one of the biggest themes in Wicked, and you see it pop up all throughout the story in different ways and to varying degrees of nuance, but the animal racism is done the least gracefully by far, and that's because it isn't in the plot so the movie can seriously explore racial prejudice as it implies. It's there to drive the conflict between Elphaba, the wizard, and Glinda. And this isn't great because that means the topic of racism is entirely incidental, and that is very not how you want to handle a topic as loaded as this. It's been on my mind since then, and it is Black History Month, so you know what? Now feels like a good time for this video. Let's talk about fantasy racism and where people so often get it wrong, shall we? Before we continue though, I would like to extend an olive branch to the Wicked fans out there. I'm sorry the second movie was so disappointing, and in all fairness, the movie doesn't handle its fantasy racism in the worst way I've ever seen, and it actually does address it in part 2 instead of brushing it under the rug like the stage musical does. That said, still could have been handled better. Also, I'd like people to keep in mind that this will be a simplified take on a truly complex topic that comes at it from a writing perspective and is therefore not meant to be a catch-all guide to or explanation of racism as a whole. As someone so white I'm the only blonde in my family, my understanding of it is limited by my life experiences and cannot be compared to that of someone who's lived the non-white experience, and I would therefore encourage you to seek out minority voices on this subject after this. I personally recommend the Morbid Zoo's video, The Problem with Race Horror, for her incredibly nuanced take on the subject, as well as the rest of her videos because she makes phenomenal content. I'll link to her video down below. Right then, tenuous piece established, let's dig into this. Fantasy racism, or fantastic racism if you want to go by the TV trope's name, is the term for fictional discrimination based on the racial or species traits of beings that do not exist in real life. I know that sounds obvious, but I do feel the need to specify that in case someone thinks it only applies to the fantasy genre, which isn't the case. Elves, orcs, vampires, aliens, robots, mutants, talking animals, sentient piles of sediment constructed vaguely in the shape of a living being, any and all of these can be made the victim of fantasy racism. And the genre is far less important than the authorial intent and the execution thereof. And yes, I am fully aware that I'm working with an incredibly simplified definition of racism, but I'm trying to keep this video both approachable and comprehensible. Now then, there are probably two general versions of this that spring to mind when I say fantasy racism. The first is the kind that exists almost entirely as background radiation in modern fantasy, where two groups ardently and categorically hate each other for no other reason than that's just what those groups do. Elves and dwarves would probably be the most common example of this, though you might also think of humans and orcs, vampires and werewolves, or I don't know, insert group here, I'm sure you can think of one. I'm also sure someone's come up with a term for this particular brand of fantasy racism, but I don't know it, so I'm just calling it backdrop racism for the purpose of this video. Backdrop racism, as we're using it for this video, refers to the extremely token and almost obligatory racial tensions that exist between fictional groups that doesn't really get explored or explained and isn't even important enough to really be connected to the narrative or a character arc or the themes of the story in any way. It is literally only there because someone decided that there should be some racism. I'm not going to say backdrop racism is strictly bad, but it is incredibly lazy and thus only works in very shallow stories. It is also not what this video is actually about, but I wanted to take a moment to cover it because I know someone will ask and I'd rather be thorough either way. You may also be wondering why backdrop racism exists if there's no real point to it outside of just having it there, and the short answer is Tolkien. It cannot be overstated just how heavily the works of J.R.R. Tolkien have influenced the modern fantasy genre, which I am far from the first person to point out. And his writing is almost entirely the reason why elves and dwarves and orcs are characterized the way they are at all. Right down to the fact that there's never been any love lost between those first two groups. But just as people adopt these superficial qualities of Tolkien's dwarves without any of the nuance he spent way too much time hewing into them, they also don't take the time to establish why the two groups have such bad blood to begin with. Which Tolkien did, by the way. He actually gave a salient origin to their conflict, because the man was just built different, and nobody nowadays puts in the same psychotic level of world building work he did, aside from maybe Matt Mercer. I mean, there's definitely an important conversation to be had about Tolkien's very likely unconscious use of racial coding and how the ontological nature of racial traits in his books stems from incredibly racist attitudes, but that's very much a topic for another day. No, the fantasy racism we're focusing on for this video is the other big kind, where creators using the age-old tactic of exploring heavy real-world issues through the use of metaphor and has it play a central role in the greater narrative or a character's arc. 2 fucking pages to get to the point. That's how you can tell I'm a real video essayist. Okay, so there are obviously more examples of fantasy racism, both good and bad, than can be comfortably fit into an essay of any reasonable length. So this video isn't going to be a comprehensive list of all the ways you can employ the trope or all the ways you can fuck it up. No, in an attempt to keep this at least a little focused, I'm going to work my way through just 4 examples of how it's been done poorly in the past, analyze how they did it wrong, and then we're going to go over 2 pieces of media that I thought handled it really well. Sound good? Good. Okay, off we go then. Okay, so this might sound counterintuitive, but one of the biggest missteps you can make with fantasy racism is having it where you don't need to. This isn't me saying that you shouldn't use fantasy racism, or racism metaphors in general by the way. This is about understanding when it's better to just portray it without the metaphor at all. Star vs. the Forces of Evil was a show that originally billed itself as a fun Saturday morning cartoon-style romp that, starred Star, a princess from the magical kingdom of Muni, who was like if you gave Dave the Barbarian estrogen and put him on a permanent sugar buzz. The show was a wild, zany mess of narwhal explosions, goofy villains, and enough ship teasing to open an extremely successful strip club for maritime vehicles. If you're familiar with the show, you probably know where I'm going with this. Whilst Star vs. started out lighthearted and goofy, that initial tone quickly gave way to a far more serious, overarching narrative about racism, landback, and colonialism that was handled, let's say, less than gracefully. Now, the fact that the showrunners wanted to talk about these subjects isn't a bad thing in and of itself. It's more so the fact that they both weren't as knowledgeable on the subject as they need to be, as well as the tiny issue of the show partially taking place on Earth, with all of our same history of European colonialism and all the slavery and genocide that went along with it. And it's not the desire to talk about heavier subjects in a kids show that's the problem. Kids media is actually uniquely positioned to talk about subjects like discrimination in a way that is both surprisingly deep and easy to get into. For example, The Ghost and Molly McGee, a show that's like injecting the power of friendship and the love of life directly into your eyeballs, actually had an episode on the importance of religious ceremony and cultural identity in the face of tragedies like the Holocaust. So Star vs. wanting to talk about racism and colonialism wasn't guaranteed to fail. But the problem was that not only did the showrunners not really understand colonialism, they also bungled the message by dragging it out way too fucking long in favour of mystery mongering and ship teasing, as well as making the victims of the colonialist narrative literal actual monsters. And look, there's value in telling a story about looking past appearances and false narratives, but the problem with using monsters in this scenario is that it creates too much of an emotional distance for the audience, who will just mentally write it off as a racism metaphor and not have to contend with the reality that racism isn't about one group that's an entirely different species. It's about treating a group that's only marginally different as if that tiny difference makes them inherently inferior to you. And it also didn't help that the racism was taking place in a literal different dimension and involved essentially just humans, but emotionally separated for the audience by calling them something else, and again, by making it against monsters. And the reason behind this boneheaded choice, aside from the showrunners not being very smart, was comfort. The thing about Star vs. is that if they had wanted to talk about racism seriously, they had the perfect vector for it in the Diazes, a Hispanic family living in LA. All they would have had to do is have a single episode where Star's antics get Marco in trouble with the police, while her blonde white ass gets preferential treatment to open her eyes to the reality of racial prejudice and instill the idea both in her and the audience that there can be extremely different consequences for people based off their skin tone. And it would have had a greater impact than the whole of the show's actual seasons combined. This is why the general rule of thumb for this sort of thing is that if you can directly depict it, then you really fucking should. But the showrunners didn't want to, because they would have had to face the reality of benefiting from systemic racism that was a little more than these extremely white creators were comfortable with, and they likely assumed their target white audience wouldn't be comfortable with it either. Also, Marco named his motorcycle Nachos and had a dozen cactuses in his front yard, so that was probably a good sign that Nefsi wasn't exactly interested in portraying Hispanic people in a particularly sensitive light. Or, let's be real, even taking them seriously. I'm gonna be honest, if you're not willing to sit with the uncomfortable truth of racism, especially with the truth that all white people benefit from systemic racism, no matter how racist or not racist they personally act, then you probably shouldn't be trying to broach the subject in your work. It will only damage the message you're trying to send by emotionally distancing your audience from it. And I can promise you that white people will survive being a little uncomfortable about it.
A broken system isn't fixed with a broken solution. A revolution isn't built without a hint of delusion.
Okay, I don't want to stick on this one very long because Rwby's handling of the White Fang and the creator's kindergarten level understanding of racial topics has already been worked to death by bigger and better YouTubers, but I feel it's still important to at least briefly discuss it. The source of the problem behind the portrayal of the White Fang as a peaceful organization that lost its way and turned to violence is simple. Miles and Carrie believe that we're living in a post-racism society, and thus they believe that racism is only a problem on the individual level and not a systemic or societal issue, which means they view protesters as annoying nuisances making problems out of nothing. And when someone views a social movement with dismissive contempt, anything they create that involves that movement will carry that same attitude. I've said this before and I'll say it again. The way you depict social movements in your work will say more about you than it will ever say about the movement itself. Allow me to cut to the chase. Adam's White Fang in Rwby is meant to be an allusion to the Black Panther Party, which is why Blake has that throwaway line about how they used to organize peaceful protests, but then it changed and they got violent and that got results, but it was bad because it meant people were afraid of them, and also why Adam's motivation is a mixture of petty revenge, undirected violent impulses, and a dogmatic belief in faunist supremacy, because the creators view the Black Panthers as villains motivated by racism against white people who pervert the quote-unquote proper form of protest for their own sick ends. This is something people need to understand. The Black Panthers are not the fucking black equivalent to the KKK. There is no non-white equivalent to the Klan, nor can there be, because the Klan could only exist due to the inherently racist power structures that empowered white supremacists to act without fear of repercussion. The Black Panther Party wasn't created because they believed black people were superior to white people, nor was it founded on the ideal of all white people should die. It was founded because, among a variety of other reasons, the police wouldn't stop killing black people, and peaceful protest wasn't getting them to fucking stop. Which is a problem that, unless you've spent the last 10 years living under a rock with your hands clapped over your ears, you should be well aware has not gone away. Here's another thing people need to understand. Violent protest is not the opposite of peaceful protest. It is self-defense and often the direct result of peaceful measures being met with increasing violence from your oppressors. If we lived in an ideal world, peaceful protest would be all we ever needed. But we don't live in that ideal world, which is why sometimes peaceful protest isn't enough, and sometimes violence is a necessary solution. I need to hammer this point home. The idea that peaceful protest is the only way for marginalized groups to be seen as legitimate is detrimental to social progress because it trains people to only see the victims of oppression as being victims, so long as they allow their oppressors to stomp on their throats and never fight back. It is a trap that uses respectability to deprive people of an important tool for protest and self-defense and holds victims to a double standard of violence, where those with power can utilize any amount of violence against them, but the moment they grow violent in turn, they've gone too far. Peaceful protest isn't meant to be the only acceptable solution. It is meant to be a courtesy and a threat. It is meant to say, there are far more of us than there are of you, and this is the step we take before we drag you from your tower and lock you into the guillotine. Allow me to draw a parallel for you to put this into context. The Stonewall riots didn't happen because they were less civilized or because they hadn't tried being peaceful. The Stonewall riots happened because the police harassed and brutalized innocent people too many times. And gay people only have the rights we do now because the people at Stonewall decided that they weren't going to have their humanity trampled on anymore. You need to understand the history of a group before you decide to depict them a certain way in your work. Stories have real power, and you can do a hell of a lot more damage through malicious depiction than you think. Okay, let's take things down a notch for just a moment and talk about Zootopia. It's no secret that Disney's furry propaganda movie was made to be a metaphor for racism, and it's also no secret that despite the movie's popularity and the whole hell of a lot they were doing, the metaphor didn't really end up working very well. And the reason it didn't really work came down to one simple issue. They made the marginalized group the predators. The reason this is a problem is because the dynamic between oppressor and oppressed is completely different if the group that's supposedly being oppressed is an actual physical threat, even if that threat was in the past. Zootopia establishes that at one point predators were a threat, but now they make up only 10% of the population while still somehow holding more power, and that just isn't how it works at all. Racism metaphors immediately fail if you make the oppressed group predators or actually dangerous creatures like vampires or werewolves or whatever, because in doing so you have given a very good reason for people to not want them around. And there has never been a good reason for racism. Racism isn't logical, and doing what Zootopia does and drawing parallels between marginalized groups and actually dangerous creatures bungles the metaphor entirely. It also doesn't help that the movie was trying to be about the concept of racism in general and not racism in a specific form or against a certain group. I need to stress this to people. Do not make the marginalized group in your metaphor present an actual literal danger. Not only does it fuck up the metaphor, it also has the unfortunate effect of sending the message that you should fear those groups. And that's not a good look, because historically speaking, bigots have depicted the people they don't like as dangerous to perpetuate the lie that they deserve to be discriminated against in the first place. This was the entire thrust behind Birth of a Nation, a movie that depicted black people as animalistic savages that were a danger to innocent white women and could only be stopped by the heroic KKK. To be clear, I am not saying this was Disney's intent when they made the movie, but I am saying that this is the history of racist depiction that they accidentally hearkened to in their carelessness. They did a bit better with Zootopia 2, but that's largely because it went from a metaphor for all racism ever to, I think they were going for a metaphor for the dehumanization and displacement of Native Americans. I don't know, I haven't had the time to pick over the film with a fine-toothed comb just yet, so I can't say just how well it held up. What's funny is that there was actually a lot of potential in Zootopia to discuss racism in a variety of ways, but they would have had to scale it down and focus on more personal interactions to achieve that. I won't go into all of them, but the example I keep coming back to in my head is when they were looking at the security footage and Nick just thoughtlessly disparages the wolves as dumb weirdos who howl for no reason.
Bet you a nickel one of them's gonna howl. And there it is. I mean, what is it with wolves and the howling? It's like...
Howlers.
This right here? This is a really good example of casual racism. If the film had thought to call out Nick's attitude towards another canine and portrayed howling as a part of wolf culture instead of just passing it off as a joke, then the movie could have made a strong point about how thoughtlessly dismissive these kinds of statements are and made people think about the way they do so in their own lives. I don't know, just food for thought. Oh, Dragon Age. If ever there were a definition of a mixed bag, it'd be this fucking series. Dragon Age has always had a strange relationship to today's topic. On one hand, racism has been a prevalent theme since the very first game, and on the other, it's almost never fucking handled it well in the slightest. From the first game throwing the city elf origin into the role of state-sanctioned rape victim and throwing slurs around like fireworks in the summer, to the third game giving you companions who actively hate the minority groups they're a part of, the series has often had a massive problem with approaching the subject with any level of maturity. At least until Veilguard, where the writers decided to actually grow the fuck up, but I digress. But between all of the pre-Veilguard games, the one with the biggest issues in how it handled the topic was Dragon Age 2, no contest at all. Dragon Age actually has two different groups that act as the main victims of racism, that being elves and mages, and while neither group is handled, well, at all for the first 3 games in the series, it's the mages that end up getting the worst of it in the second game specifically. To make a long story short, mages in Dragon Age are constantly being enslaved and murdered by the Templars of a religious organization known as the Chantry because there exists the possibility that they might abuse their magic and could be possessed by a demon. And the Chantry is fanatically devoted to killing mages for the slightest of perceived infractions. Even as early as the first game, we see the Chantry invoking what's known as the Rite of Annulment, which is essentially an order to kill every mage in the circle, including the children. And in the second game, the Chantry begins to take mages and make them tranquil, which is the magical equivalent to a lobotomy, and an experience so horrible that if a mage should regain lucidity afterward for even a moment, they will use every second of it to beg for death. This is obviously horrible and fucked up, but what makes Dragon Age 2's handling of it specifically bad is that the game tries really fucking hard to both sides the issue. And you can't fucking both sides a genocide, which, make no mistake, the Chantry is actively trying to commit on mages, because genocide is the most one-sided issue you could possibly have. The Chantry can only attempt the actions it does because of the power structures in place that give them massive systemic power over mages, and no matter how you try to spin it, genocide is always wrong, and good writing never sides with the oppressor. David Gator, head writer for Dragon Age 2's story, really wanted to make the Templar versus Mages conflict morally grey. He said as much in an interview. But the problem is that not only can you not make genocide a morally grey issue, the player base just wasn't buying it. Players overwhelmingly supported the mages, much to Gator's chagrin, because it was very clear to anyone with eyes that this was not an equal conflict, especially when the games start breaking out the mage death camps and the lobotomies. And this is an important lesson to learn from this. You cannot both sides oppression. I've said this before, but oppression only works because of the power structures in place. You cannot have oppression between two equal groups. Dragon Age 2 really tried to portray the conflict as if it were a case of individual Templars being racist to mages and individual mages being racist right back, but that wasn't what was fucking happening. This was a massive organization with overwhelming power, ruthlessly murdering people without it, based on the idea that they might abuse their abilities. But in drawing comparisons to some of the most heinous crimes against humanity, Gator ensured that players would overwhelmingly side against the Templars, because of course they would. Even when the game tries to paint Anders blowing up the Chantry as him going too far, it falls completely flat because it is a completely earned act of retribution, and killing your oppressors is neither an evil nor morally grey act. To draw a historical comparison, if you tried to argue that the slaves of Saint-Domingue were in the wrong for killing the plantation owners and burning all their shit, you would be just as wrong as anyone who tries to argue that mages shouldn't kill Templars in self-defense. And for what it's worth, mages don't get to choose if they're mages, but Templars certainly get to choose to be Templars. Alright, so now is when we start to get into the media that I felt handled the topic really well. And to be clear, I don't think these are the only ways to do fantasy racism well, I just felt these presented two very good and very different options for people to learn from. So let's get into them, starting with Castlevania Nocturn. Nocturn sets itself apart from the majority of other examples of fantasy racism by using its fantasy aspects to supplement a discussion on real racism, which I honestly really like. As opposed to the first animated series, Nocturn takes place at a recognizable point in real-world history, the French Revolution, and it uses the time and setting to make a statement on slavery, freedom, and colonialism as well. Nocturn's discussion on these themes centers on the character Annette, an escaped slave from the island of Saint-Domingue, better known in the modern day as the Republic of Haiti. The island was once the single wealthiest colony in the Americas thanks to the sugar and coffee plantations that were among the most brutally run slave trade powered industries in the world. This is one of the great things about Nocturn. The creators really knew their history and brought it to the forefront of the story. With the exception of Elizabeth Bathory, a serious effort was made to write the characters as realistically shaped by their time period and the experiences they went through. And this is why Nocturn not only states that every plantation owner was a vampire, but uses vampires in their most historically significant symbolism: the parasitism of the rich and corrupt and the destruction caused by the ideals of subjugation. With the exception of Olrox and later Terra, each vampire of note in Nocturn is used to demonstrate the deranged nature of racism and the colonial mindset, and nowhere is this more front and center than with the main villain of the story, Elizabeth Bathory. Elizabeth is called the Vampire Messiah and worshipped by vampires like the Comte de Vaublanc, the plantation owner that once owned Annette, for her promise to subjugate everyone they consider lesser than them and reinstate a so-called natural order. And Elizabeth herself is only a true threat because she stole the power of another culture, having drunk the blood of Sekhmet and claimed it as her own. An entire mythos is built around the idea that she is a goddess, but her strength comes from the subjugation of another culture, and her entire goal is to subjugate everyone.
I've been told about the nauseating little revolution in the New World. Watch how we will get them to eat their own vomit here in France. Then you will see how to deal with you American upstarts.
Erzsébet is colonialism made manifest, and this is why the villains follow her. They all believe she will destroy whoever they think isn't worthy of existing and raise them up instead. And so no matter how much it contradicts what they themselves should care about, or how blatant the reality of the woman becomes, they still throw their lot in with her. She is the embodiment of the ideals behind subjugation and self-absorption and slavery. And speaking of, this show does not shy away from the truth of just how fucking horrible slavery was, nor how rancid the mindset behind it is.
The first time a slave runs away, they're branded with this mark on their shoulder. Second time, they're hamstrung. Third time, killed. When I was a girl, I was taught to be frightened of people on our plantation with this mark on their body. Troublemakers. But after I escaped myself, I saw them differently. The people with this mark, they're the people who know intimately how much freedom can cost. They wear it every day. So I do too.
How long were you a slave? 15 years? More? Born in chains to a woman in chains. Some people look backwards and forwards and all they see are slaves. You, your people, my property.
I would honestly urge anyone who wants to talk about subjects like slavery in an urban fantasy setting to watch this show, because it is a masterful demonstration of how to intermix fantasy and real history to create something greater than the sum of its parts. I actually made a video on the themes of oppression and liberation in the show a while ago, which I'll link to down below for anyone who's interested in it. I'm still really quite proud of it. Now then, onto the final subject of the day.
This is when the party ends. I can stand here listening to you and your racist friend.
Okay, this section contains major spoilers for Metaphor ReFantasio, so skip over this if it's going to bother you. Got it? Good. Of all the games I've seen explore the themes of racism in the stories, Metaphor is probably the most competently done, and also one of the most explicit. Prejudice is one of the main themes of the game, and it explores that theme through the lens of race, class, and even religion, though the first point is the only one truly relevant to the video. The game isn't perfect, of course, and there are places that it could definitely have improved, but that doesn't mean it isn't worth talking about, nor that it isn't worthy of praise. What makes Metaphor's utilization of fantasy racism work so well is that it comes at it from a multitude of different angles, exploring how it's implemented and how it affects people on both the individual and societal level. The races of the world are split amongst the 9 tribes, and the game actually explores the attitudes and treatment that each tribe is subject to, a lot of which is due to stereotyping and prejudice. For example, the Clamar and Rassant tribes are considered the most populous and therefore the most widely accepted, holding the majority of political power and often looking down at other tribes. In contrast, the Parapis are nearly as populous as the other two, but are largely relegated to second-class citizen status and are even banned from participating in politics. The Parapis are statistically the most abused tribe, being regularly killed for minor crimes, used in cruel experiments, and, in Hulkenberg's Bond event, being serially executed by Rodanthe to gain political power because he knows people will unquestioningly accept that they're criminals who deserve death without needing proof. You also get things like Heismay being a knight in the Shadow Brigade, a knight corps considered to be lower who have their accomplishments hidden or stolen due to discrimination because he's a Ujif, and Heismay himself is prejudiced against Parapis, which the game does not let go unmentioned. Or situations like the child of Sanctorus Joanna having been murdered in his crib by the nursemaid because she was superstitious of his mixed blood. Or Rudolph, one of the king's candidates, who openly plots to enforce segregation and Roussant supremacy, mirroring the ideals of white nationalists. Or the entire assassination plot having been conceived by the fantasy pope because the prince was half Elder, a tribe he'd already attempted to genocide multiple times in the past. The game does a lot with the subject, and I could honestly go on for hours talking about it, but my favourite part of the game in this regard, and it's probably my favourite way any game has done this, is when the game reveals the twist behind the origin of the tribes.
The people we now call tribes were either born of artificial division for the sake of the war effort, or natural adaptation to survive the hellscape after. Such drastic physical changes would normally have taken eons to effect. Accelerated by Magla, however, It was only a matter of a scant few centuries.
This right here, this is probably the best metaphor for the mindset behind racism and bigotry I've ever seen. Hatred stemming from minor differences leading to catastrophe, and the extremely minor physical differences being forcibly increased and fixated upon to act as an excuse to hold people apart from each other and create a completely arbitrary standard of who is superior and who is lesser. That's just the racist mindset taken to its logical extreme. This was the moment that all of the game's themes came together to deliver a truly impressive gut punch of a twist, and it's part of why the game handles the topic so well, because they were working from the ground up with an intimate understanding of not only how racism works, but how it will logically end left unchecked. Metaphor truly was a fantastic exploration of racism in a fantasy setting. Fantasy racism is, at the end of the day, a tool. It is a specific tool in the arsenal of a writer for telling a story, and that's why it's so important to handle it with care. The fun thing about the human mind is that we're built to understand and process stories better than anything else, which is what makes storytelling so powerful and potentially dangerous. Whether the topic is racism or the humanity of the LGBT community or the nature of grief and trauma, the stories we're told will always stick with us and impact us far more than any statistical fact ever could. This is really what makes it so important to approach topics like this with care, because whether you realize it or not, you will be influencing someone's understanding of it for better or worse, and you really want to make sure it's for the better. This is why it's important to depict marginalized groups with respect, and why you want to avoid the pitfalls discussed in this video, and the best way to do that is to educate yourself, to understand where racist attitudes stem from, to avoid depicting groups as being inherently threatening or as evil for defending themselves. This is why it's so important to talk about things in frank terms and to understand that the presence of systemic power absolutely precludes the possibility of both sides being in the wrong, that racism affects the whole of society and is not and never has been merely an individual issue, because it matters that people understand it, and it matters that they be told the truth about it, no matter how uncomfortable that truth might be. Anyone who tells you that fiction has no bearing on reality is lying through their teeth, both to you and themselves. And it's important that, no matter how fantastical or imaginary your setting is, you consider the impact it will have on the very real people that experience it. When it comes to depicting racism, remember to educate yourself, write with respect, and for fuck's sake, do not carelessly throw it in as an aside to drive a different conflict in the plot. Thank you for watching, and a huge thanks to my Patreon members for their support, especially Lustrous Lizard, Tetraphobe49, Owen Oofs, and Wisteria. God, I've had this video on my mind for a while now, so it feels really good to finally get it done. I am serious about checking out the Morbid Zoo, by the way. She's a far better YouTuber than me, and her videos are fucking fantastic. I do have one more video planned for this month. This one will be on a far less serious topic, so look forward to that in a week or two, ADHD willing. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video and that you're all doing okay. Take care of yourselves, and I hope you have a lovely day.